Okay, welcome everyone. You want to put your name and where you're from in the chat while we wait for just a few more seconds for a few more people to join, and we'll get started. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started now, and people will continue to join while we do our welcoming. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon in some cases. Welcome to this year-long seminar series on data sharing for societies. As you can see on the screen, today's seminar will be discussing journal data policies and getting started with a framework and examples from society journals. So my name is Leah McEwen, and I'm going to be moderating this session today. I'm the chemistry librarian at Cornell University, where I support scholarly communication activities, including scientific data management and preparation of data and other materials for publication. I'm also a founder and co-chair of the Chemistry Research Data Alliance interest group at the Research Data Alliance. And today I'm representing the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, the standards organization in chemistry. IUPAC is pleased to be one of the 8 societies and federations that are collaborating on this effort for the data sharing seminar series. I'm also being joined here by representatives from AAAS Science, the American Astronomical Society, the American Chemical Society, the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society Board on Data Stewardship, the Council of Scientific Society Presidents, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, and the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Science. And we are delighted to welcome you today to our seminar for July. So I have just a few minutes to show a couple of items from my own experience in data, just to set the stage for today. So just really quickly here, because I don't want to take the floor from our speakers, but we've been noodling around this conversation in chemistry for quite a long time. Here are some slides from 2015. As a chemistry librarian, I started talking to chemists at Cornell about how they're managing their data and sharing it as early as 2013. And they all, most of them mentioned to me, we are preparing supplemental information and figures in our manuscripts, but what could we do to do better with our data files? Can we do this without taking any more prep time? So for them, the key thing were the workflows and not having to spend a lot of time doing this. And of course, there weren't a lot of policies or guidelines or tools available back then. A couple of years later, many stakeholders, including other chemistry librarians, publishers, repositories, started thinking about, well, what are the existing policies for publishing data along with articles in chemistry? And we took a look at some of the top chemistry journals and found that data types such as crystallography, I think many of us have heard about this use case of crystallography, and indeed do have established publishing guidelines for data and connected into repository workflows. However, there are a lot of other data types in chemistry that many journals require as part of the reported information, but these have been incorporated into the manuscript or supplemental PDFs. So then these stakeholders came together and we developed a workshop that was funded by the National Science Foundation in 2019 to work together on some of these challenges around workflows and guidelines, particularly on the spectra data type, which is a very common data type in chemistry. So if we could match the workflows in crystallography for spectroscopy. And we came away with that with a couple of key outcomes, including a publishing pilot with the American Chemical Society. And I believe they've had around 300 authors submitting data in this pilot to date. So that's exciting. We also realized that we need better metadata standards and data formats to support this that are modern. So we went back to IUPAC to work on our specification. And then we also provided some draft guidance for chemists as they're working with these files to get them ready to share. And all of that is openly available for people to review. Then just a quick word about IUPAC as the organization I'm representing today. We're over a century old. We have developed standards for communicating information and data about chemistry for a very long time, but we're now in the process of transitioning a lot of these key standards and representations into digital machine readable, fair, enabling forms, particular focus on metadata. So you can, in aligning ourselves with supporting FAIR. So that's just a quick word on how the trajectory's been going in chemistry. I'm going to stop sharing now and introduce our speakers for today. So it is my pleasure now to get into the real meat of today's seminar on journal data policies. I'm going to start with introducing the speakers and then we'll go into the talk. So first up today, we'll have Iain Hrynaszkiewicz. He's the Director of Open Research Solutions at PLOS and co-author of the Research Data Policy Framework for All Authors and Publishers that was recently developed by the RDA interest group on policy standardization and implementation, and that's the policy framework that that's going to form the core of our discussion today. Iain has many years of experience in scientific publishing with a focus on data and open research. So in addition to all these other hats, he's also recently been part of the steering group of the STM Year of Research Data that we celebrated in 2020, and is also an advisory board member of Fair Sharing. So thank you, Iain, for joining us today. Iain will be followed by Jake Yeston, who is the editor for Physical Sciences Research at AAAS at Science. Jake has been involved in coordinating the research content at Science in the areas of chemistry, biochemistry, and applied physics since 2004. Jake has taken a keen interest in the challenges with research data associated with publication, and he was a very great contributor and participant at that 2019 NSF-funded chemistry data sharing workshop that I mentioned. Jake will be providing us with some background on the development of the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines, known as TOP, that was published in Science in 2015, and it's one of the core sets of guidelines that informed the development of the RDA Research Data Policy Framework that we'll be discussing. And then Jake will be followed by Townsend, who is the Director of Publications Operations at the American Geophysical Union. Randy is also the coordinator of scientific integrity and professional ethics with AGU Publishing, and has also worked with journals publication, production, and peer review workflows. I haven't previously had the pleasure to meet Randy, but as someone who has worked closely with publishers in my own field for many years, especially on challenges around workflow and data, I really appreciate the range of experience he's bringing to these challenges of supporting authors in this effort. And so Randy will be sharing some perspectives on the evolution of the AGU policy on data and software as a society publisher, and how this aligns the recommendations in the RDA data policy framework. So we are delighted that these speakers could all be with us today to share their practical experiences in putting together the framework and starting to implement it. Each speaker will speak for about 12 minutes, and we hope to have plenty of time for questions after the presentations. So before turning over to our first speaker, I will ask that you keep yourself on mute during the presentations, but please feel free to type your questions into the chat box or use your virtual hand raise function in Zoom. And if you haven't already done so, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, tell us who you are and where you're from. All right, I think we can turn it over to Iain now. Thank you very much. Iain?
Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I'm sure we're all used to hearing that phrase quite a lot. So I'm going to talk about the development of a journal research data policy framework. And I realize this may not be the most exciting topic for a Friday, but I do like to remind myself as often as possible what we're trying to achieve at an appropriate level of abstraction. I think what I hope we could all agree is that we're trying to publish more trustworthy, more reliable research, and that often means making things more transparent. And research data is one part of making research more transparent, and research data policies are one of the tools that we have in our box in order to help achieve that goal. So that's what I like to remind myself as context as often as possible. And with regards to policies as a tool, as a solution, when we talk to researchers or when we survey researchers, we do observe that the requirements, the policies of journals and publishers and indeed funders tend to feature relatively highly in the things that motivate researchers or incentivize them to make their data available. So that's encouraging. But of course, as well as what people say, we can observe what they do. And research data policies are, of course, not a new thing. They have existed for certain types of research data for a quarter of a century or more. And this slide is showing some observational data of what happens when different kinds of data policies are introduced in two different groups of journals. Over on the left-hand side, this graph is showing that at Biomed Central, BMC, 60 or more journals at the time in the BMC series, in 2012, there was the introduction of an optional policy, an encouraged policy for researchers to provide a statement about where their data are in their papers, what we now call data availability statements. And what we can see is that it certainly had some effect. Around 5% of authors opted in to provide that information. But when in 2015 in Biomed Central's case and around 2014 in PLOS's case, which is just to make you aware that's where I work, when those organizations introduced a mandatory policy, then as you can see, the number of publications, the proportion of publications that included these statements about data availability increases dramatically. The charts are getting lighter on the right hand side, which means lots more authors are providing that information. So policies are effective, and they're particularly effective if they're implemented in ways that have mandatory checks associated with them. So they are effective tools. And since 2014 in particular and 2016 onwards, there has been a huge growth in the number of journals, the number of publishers that have research data policies. Most of the major publishers, Springer Nature, Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, etc., have introduced initiatives that apply usually a number of discrete different types of data policies to their thousands of journals. There have, of course, also been other initiatives not from publishers, such as the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines TOP, which we'll hear more about later. In fact, 13,000 journals or more, even just in the STM space in 2020, have some form of research data policy. So this is all good, generally speaking, for transparent, more trustworthy science and research, but it does create some unintended consequences. We've got multiple similar but different policies and sometimes some terminologies that don't always mean the same thing. We also have different levels of support that's available for different journals and different research communities, which amongst other things can lead to some confusion for researchers and the staff who support and work with researchers with these different policy requirements, not just from publishers, of course, sometimes from funding agencies as well. So responding to this issue in around 2017, I and a number of other people named here on the slide formed an interest group within a global community called the Research Data Alliance, which is a great forum for global collaboration from multiple different perspectives and stakeholders on shared problems. And our shared problem was the increase in research data policies and whether there may be opportunities to harmonize and to encourage more consistent implementation. Now, this group actually is intended to think about policy, not just for journals, but for other stakeholders as well. But journals was where we decided to begin for hopefully obvious reasons. So our first project, our first assignment began in 2017, and it was to develop this research data policy framework that we've referred to a few times already today. The methodology was open and collaborative, started with calls with the community, various different stakeholders, gathering requirements, what would the needs or the expectations be of researchers, publishers, funders, librarians, societies for the features of research data policies. Also coupled with that was a lot of exploring the landscape of what publishers and journals had already been implementing. There was an open process whereby drafts of the policy framework and the lists of features were made available, receiving many comments from many reviewers, and there was an iterative refinement and development of the framework online and at various in-person meetings at the RDA, which happens a couple of times a year. Eventually made available as a preprint, and then last year published in a peer-reviewed journal. Now the paper's available, it's open access, it's very long, just as a health warning. Lots of detail about implementation for people who are concerned with such things. But the key figure, if you like, the paper in one slide is really represented here. The main output of this work was a list of 14, that's the column on the left-hand side, 14 features of journal research data policies. So covering things like a definition of what the policy applies to, data citation, data availability statements, peer review of data. And the other key part of the approach is that there were not just 14 features, but there were a number of different types or levels or tiers of policy, ranging from the first kind, which has the fewest number of features, up to the sixth kind, which has the most number of features and the most stringent implementation of that policy. So the effort required increases as one goes from 1 through to 6. An important thing is that this is a framework. It's not a standard. We're not expecting all journals and publishers to have to update to fully align with the wording here or in the template policies that we provide. But importantly, it was designed such that it was compatible with existing publisher policy frameworks. And this slide is intended to highlight that if we take Springer Nature's or Wiley's or Taylor and Francis or PLOS's or Elsevier's policies, one could map those different policy types onto the framework. So it's intended to, provide some common tools and features and resources, but not necessarily be a new standard that everybody then has to change towards. A couple of other key features that are available from the initiative and within the paper is that we define what the features are to try to convey what they are, but also where it's available. So this is the top right-hand corner of this slide. We try to provide some research evidence as to why it's there. So why is it sensible to have information about data repositories in your policy? Also, bottom of the slide, there is template policy text for each of the 6 different types, which sort of layer on top of one another, getting more detailed, moving from the first through to the 6th policy. So those template policies are available, they're reusable, they're with the paper as supporting information. So hopefully that's a useful tool, particularly for journals that may be earlier in the process of thinking about data policies than others. So what kind of impact have we seen, and what kind of adoption have we seen of the framework? Particularly in the last 1 to 2 years, we've seen some really encouraging developments. We have this ongoing collaboration with the STM Association, which represents about 150 publishers, of course, in the STM space. And Shelley, it's already been mentioned that they have this research data year, which is now not just a year, it's ongoing. And the policy framework is a resource that's been promoted in order to promote adoption of data policies, which is one of the objectives of that STM initiative. We had some very early adopters of the framework, Scientific Data Journal, which is a Springer Nature journal, and all of PLOS's, at the time then 7 journals, reviewed the framework and made some tweaks to their policy features in order to align with it, in particular providing some language about data management plans, DMPs. The paper itself was published in 2020, and for those of us concerned with more traditional measures of impact, it has been cited. And of course, I've chosen the highest number from Google Scholar because we like the highest number. But importantly, and more seriously, 2 of those citations were actually organic use cases and adoption of the framework, which actually we weren't aware of until we saw the papers published. And I'm just going to spend the last minute telling you about a couple of those use cases to give you an example of how it's being used, or two examples of how it's being used. So the first example, and both of these are actually published as peer-reviewed papers, which are cited here. So the first example was the use of the framework and that list of features as a self-assessment tool. So 31 Earth Science and Biodiversity journals published by German learned societies used the framework to assess the state of research data policies in those journals. And this is a summary of what they found with respect to the prevalence of different features in the framework. And they've used that to identify areas of potential improvement. And my last slide, the second example is more of an implementation use case. So there is a group of Slovenian scholarly journals, interestingly covering areas such as archaeology, history, linguistics, social sciences, and 4 journals piloted using the framework to add additional information to introduce or enhance data policies in their journals around areas such as data citation and data repositories. And one of the conclusions was the framework can play a role in raising awareness and providing examples of how to deal with data sharing. But it did also highlight some important areas of potential improvement insofar as how discipline-specific resources are really, really important. And that's actually quite an astute observation. The framework was intended to be discipline neutral, but certainly interesting to see how well it applies in a really diverse set of disciplines. So I think that's my talk over. And I'm going to hand over to Jake, who's going to be talking about data and software citation and what the framework might mean for Science, the journal. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Iain, I think you need to unshare your screen. Thank you. Let's see. Let's see if I can. Here we go. All right, can people see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks again very much, and thanks, Iain, for a terrific talk. It's funny, you know, I last saw Leah almost exactly 2 years ago at the IUPAC Centennial Conference in Paris. And after that, my wife and I were fortunate enough to take a vacation to Marrakesh, Morocco, which is where the photograph in my background came from. And so I think about that trip all the time because, you know, it's been my Zoom background for the last year and a half or so. And seems like that happened a much longer time ago than 2 years. So I'm glad that the vaccines are working and we're all seeing light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about science's journey in data and publishing, in the sort of interface of data sharing and data archiving and scholarly publishing. And I want to say at the outset that since I only have 10 minutes, I'm not going to say all that much about the role of AGU and COPDES in this whole process, but they really played an absolutely integral role, certainly Shelley and Brooks Hansen. And if I had a longer time to give the talk, I would talk a lot about how much AGU influenced us and influenced how we evolved in the context of the COPDES workshops that they held. So the first step that we really took on this journey was our role, and especially our editor-in-chief at the time, Marcia McNutt's role in formulating the transparency and openness promotion guidelines. And so when Marcia joined the staff, there was a lot of concern, particularly in the social sciences, about a crisis of irreproducibility. And, you know, there were a lot of high profile papers published in social psychology that were turning out to be, you know, basically completely irreproducible. And so Marcia got a couple of grants from the Arnold Foundation to hold workshops in a variety of different disciplines and try to figure out what we could do about this reproducibility problem. And the particular workshop that was focused on social science came up with a framework which they called the Transparency and Openness Promotion Framework. that came out of the workshop that they held at University of Virginia, and then they ultimately published that framework in Science in June of 2015. I put the link to that article in the chat. And the essence of the framework was that these are only 3 of the 7 or 8 different groups of different facets of the publication process that they focused on. And so in each of these cases, there were 4 levels of compliance, or 4 levels of rigor that you could treat these different facets of the publication. And you can see that they progress from level 0, which is the journal doesn't mandate all that much, to level 3, where the journal strictly asks for an explicit reproduction. And at this phase, I think most publishers are aspiring or sort of in the process of reaching level 2. It's still relatively rare for a journal to be at level 3 unless it's a specifically dedicated journal to the process of saying that everything submitted there will be independently reproduced. And so the idea here, as you can see, citation standards, data transparency, analytical methods, and code transparency, is that you're asking the authors to not only share the data, but archive them in a way that has subsequently become known as FAIR, which stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And in that way, not put the burden on the reader for, pestering the author to give them the data, but instead make data availability a fundamental component of the publishing process. So when Marcia came back and she told us that this is what she had agreed to, and we published this paper, a lot of us on the staff thought, okay, this is what we're going to do for social science papers, because that's where the crisis is. And I admit that there was a really somewhat, frankly, unjustified degree of smugness, particularly in the physical sciences, among people who said, well, this isn't our problem, so this is a good solution for Brian Nosek to deal with his crisis. And Marcia said, to her tremendous credit, said, no, this is a universal problem. It calls for a universal solution. This is a good framework, and we're going to adopt it. And there was a lot of sort of hesitation, even on our staff, which, as you can imagine, was even more broadly distributed among authors in the various different fields who this was applying to. And we sort of delayed Marcia by saying, well, we need to think about it, and we really need to, go field by field and think about what we can all do. And she gave us about a year to do that. And then she said, okay, we're done thinking about it. And she published this article, and the article said, basically science is going to comply with level 2 top guidelines by January 1st of 2017. And, because Marcia is somebody who really, really focused on getting things done in a timely fashion, she made this commitment in print, and that's what we did. We changed our guidelines. Now, of course, there is the principle and there is the practice. And so this is what went up January of 2017, our citation standards, our data standards, and you can see we added an email address for readers to write to us if we weren't living up to our own stated standards, and then we could go back to the authors and address the problems. Now, in reality, this was not a binary switch. In reality, what happened was that a lot of people said, well, okay, in my field, this isn't really a problem because it's sort of already in the supplement, right? And then we sort of inched around for about a year and realized that what was happening was we weren't really getting a good sense of how compliant we were, because there were a lot of authors who just didn't say anything one way or the other about whether they were sharing data. And so that was when we mandated the data availability statement. And really, I think there are 2 ways of looking at a data availability statement, right? I think a data availability statement is not that useful if you have it and then someone says, data availability statement, our data is not available, right? So that's a statement, but that isn't really a way of sharing your data. And so when we mandated data availability, we did not leave it open as an option for authors just to say, well, I'm opting out. What we said was, you have to say here where the data are. And if there are constraints, if you got data from some third party and that third party said, well, here are the constraints on what you have to do to use this data, and someone else needs to sign on to these same constraints, then you need to explain that all in your data availability statement. But the other thing that we really tried to focus on was we tried to focus on, can we coax authors to share more data than they were used to sharing? And the idea there really was, authors across all different disciplines really had a premise in their own minds that sharing data means, displaying figures, basically. And so they said, well, we've always shared data, right? Because we have these figures in our paper and the figures are the data. And this gets back to a really important point that came up in my own field of chemistry when Leah held that NMR workshop that she was alluding to earlier, which is, if somebody is looking at a figure, it's not clear that they'll be able to analyze what's in the figure to the quantitative extent that they would like to just by looking at the figure in a PDF. You may be able to zoom in and out, but depending on the resolution and depending on the field of view, the range over which the data set is plotted, you might not be able to find out what you really want to know. And so what we've really been doing for the last 3 years is trying to coax authors using a variety of carrots and sticks to display and share a greater proportion of their data. And our biggest remaining challenge is specifying which type of data needs to be archived for each field, because you get in a situation where authors are basically saying, data availability, our data are all in the paper. And then the editor in that field goes and says, well, your colleague actually put this full set of tabulated data here in Zenodo. What would you think about doing that too? And so that's really the direction that we've been moving. And our hope is that as that goes on, what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to keep clarifying field by field, what the baseline expectation is, whether it is tabulating data underlying a figure, whether it is going a step back and posting some sort of unprocessed data. And in that case, how far back do you want to go? Whether it's a function of, there's a particular range on the x-axis that is expected in that field. And if they're not showing that full range, then they need to go back and perhaps not in the particular figure in the main text, but in the supplement or perhaps in a repository, show data over that broader range. So that's one of the things that we're dealing with. And the second thing, again, is this third-party constraint. So if you got a data set from someone and they said, these are the stipulations, explain in great detail how other readers could undergo that process, could contact those same people. How did you contact them? How will they contact them and obtain the data that you used? So here's where we were in 2020. This was a somewhat laborious process for me, although I took solace in the fact that we only had about 800 papers. This would be much harder for, Springer to do writ large, right? But so I went through every single one of the 800 papers that we published, and I personally read the data availability statement and then followed up to look at where everything was. And I think on balance, we're doing pretty well. I think we have a ways to go, but basically what you can see is that the sort of mature classical repositories for genomics data, for structure data like the Protein Data Bank, the Cambridge Crystallographic Data Center, those are the big ones, and those are the most commonly used repositories. We also have a lot of people using institutional repositories, which I'll get to in a minute. And then we have a handful of people using Zenodo, Dryad, Dataverse, Figshare. I should also mention that 12% of our papers included a citation to code archived at Zenodo, which is better than it looks because you have to consider that a lot of our papers at the baseline don't use custom code. So I was actually very pleased with that. A handful, well, more than a handful really, of GitHub URLs were also used, even though we technically mandate that people archive at Zenodo for citation purposes. But, you know, again, that's something that I think the fact that that was just a fraction of the total means that our instructions are at least to some extent being adopted. The problem with institutional repositories a lot of times is that they don't provide DOIs. Even if they do provide persistent identifiers, formatting the citation can be a little tricky. A lot of them rely mostly on a URL. This is especially the case in Earth and Space Sciences, where each mission sets up its own kind of dedicated archive that doesn't necessarily translate easily into the DOI citation framework. So that's something that I think in the medium term we need to work on. The other point is that a lot of these more subject-specific repositories, whether that's CINO, Pangea, the climatic data centers, and in particular the materials data facility, these are repositories that have the potential to add a tremendous amount of value. And the reason for that is that they help cross-reference data. They have very specific metadata standards. And so if you're looking for, you know, a particular material or a particular natural event, and you want to collate data across multiple publications, these types of repositories could help you do that. But there's a barrier to entry. The authors need to comply with those more rigorous metadata standards. And so, of course, when you give authors the choice, they say, well, you know, Zenodo is the easiest. And so this is our next big challenge, is pushing authors a little more. You know, Zenodo is much, much better than nothing, but, you know, pushing authors to put their data in some of these more value-added subject-specific repositories is one of our big goals. So as I said, you know, these are the takeaways. The sort of mature databases have been mandated for over a decade, so their prevalence is not surprising. We need to coax authors more toward the field-specific, better metadata type of repositories. And as I said, you know, the baseline type of data and the third-party constraints. So I went through, Shelley asked me to go through how we do on the RDA 14-point categorization. We explicitly prohibit embargoes. We explicitly mandate data citation. We give researcher and author and reader support. We mandate data availability statements and mandate data sharing. So this is the kind of green light. This is the yellow light, where we still need to do some work. Definition of data. We need to do a better job of, you know, how much raw data versus processed data in each field. As I said, you know, exceptions, we do define exceptions, but we could go into a little more detail about what we want to do in each case. Same with data formats and standards. Repositories, we do link to that data site repository finder, but we don't yet set criteria such as core trust seal, which I would like to try to do, because when these institutional repositories pop up, the question of, you know, can we use this institutional repository or not is a tricky one. So this is something that going forward is high on my list of trying to do this year. Supplementary materials, we nudge authors toward repositories. We think they're better, just again for cross-referencing purposes, as Leah was alluding to, but we do still allow in certain cases supplementary posting, again, because, you know, if authors are going to get in an argument with us, it's just easier to make sure that they're putting the data somewhere. These are the things that we need to work on the hardest. Data licensing, we do not yet offer guidance, and I'm very open to having that discussion because we should. Peer review of data, this is sort of an as-needed passive situation right now. In the medium term, we really are hoping to partner with one or more repositories to make this more seamless throughout our submission and review process. That's something that we have to, you know, negotiate with our business office, and so that's also a work in progress, but we hope to make progress this year or early next year. And data management plans, I could talk for a long time about that. You know, the funders, I had a conversation with a funder where I said, well, you know, DMPs are what you do. And they said, well, yes, except we check in every 5 years and you check in every month. And so better collaboration between the journals and the funders on compliance with DMPs is a salient priority. So that's what I had to say. And I have a public blog post forthcoming offering a little more detail on the pie chart I showed earlier about our repository distribution. Questions you can ask me after this talk, or I'm always very active on Twitter, or you can feel free to send me an email. Thank you so much. And now I will turn things over to Randy to talk about AGU.
All right. Thanks, Jake. Thank you for the intro, and also thank you, Ian. Everyone can see my slides. Okay, perfect. First, I want to say that I'm really jealous of Jake's Morocco trip. I'm not going to lie. My name is Randy Townsend, Director of Publishing Operations at AGU. I also have here that I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the GW Journal of Ethics and Publishing, just to give a little bit of framework that I do approach this, a lot of these conversations with an ethical lens. So quick overview of AGU. Many of you may already know about AGU, but we're the largest earth and space science organization in the world. You can see that we have more than 60,000 members and 22 peer-reviewed journals. What I really want you to take a look at with this slide is the 650 editors and associate editors. And this entire ecosystem that's kind of represented demonstrates a series of relationships that exist. And those relationships are predicated on trust and transparency, which really support and connects all these various stakeholders. We start talking about open data and having conversations with authors about what that would mean. We had a lot of pushback for those that wanted to put data available by contacting the corresponding author. We know that wasn't the best approach, but when we had those conversations, what that did was demonstrate the potential of a compromised level of trust. So that helped frame how we approach the remainder of our activities, because we wanted to demonstrate trust, but at the same time, we wanted to also show why that particular line was not the best. So the conflicting conversations was definitely something that led us along the way. So we began our journey with a series of questions. So we said we wanted author to make all the data available, and the authors asked, well, what data? So we said, all data. And they asked, well, what do you want me to do with my data? And we said, deposit in a repository. Which repository? It's a good question. And we paused for a minute, because thinking about the different journals and all the research that are represented in Earth and Space Science, there are multiple answers to that question, and there's no one size fits all. So our response was, it depends. And then the question is, well, why is all of this necessary? And of course, as Jake mentioned, to make your data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Of course, everybody knows that. Then the question is, what about my protected and restricted data, or my terabytes of data? How do you expect me to handle that? And we heard more and more great questions that really needed a lot of consideration, but it helped us understand what we needed to really have in our discussions. So our swan dive into open data utilized the soft launch. We updated our instructions and communications, and we informed our various stakeholders of all the things we wanted to do and what we wanted to have available, and how we want to shift the cultural landscape of our part in the research endeavor. But we didn't do any hard enforcements. We're trying to educate as much as possible. And we also really wanted to identify areas that needed more attention. So we took the opportunity to really engage with our editors. We talked about why this is necessary, and we were able to identify from those conversations champions that already got it. They were already on that page. They didn't need any convincing, and many of them were already having these conversations and had given it thought about what it meant for the research that they were engaged in. Great. So remember that 650 number editor that I shared or talked about in my previous slide? Believe it or not, there were some of those that were hesitant and skeptical about all this talk about open data and a repository and making this a requirement for authors. So they had reservations about everything we were talking about, even though they understood the value and the purpose. Some of them were okay in principle with what we were talking about, just as long as we weren't talking about their data. You know, they were still that trust thing, like you're talking about my data and you're telling me to do something with it. But my favorite group is really what I call the resistance, because they saw this as nothing but problematic. We didn't have clear guidelines, we had expectations. And some of our messaging seemed inconsistent because we were still evolving as we were talking about this. And of course, naturally, there were a lot of truth in their concerns. Their concerns had merit and value, and it really helped us lean into some of the more challenging issues that needed consideration. So all good things come to an end, and we had to draw a line and say, okay, we went from the soft enforcement and we had to pivot into a more stringent level of enforcement. And of course, our resources had to lay out all the expectations of what the goal was and make it as clear as possible. At every opportunity, we echoed our goals and expectations. And most important was really to stay engaged with those early adopters because they were truly the champions of our message, and they would amplify what those goals were. Keeping them informed with the updates as things shifted and new answers were emerging was really paramount to help us amplify what our goals were, and letting them know if there was a shift, that this is what the new expectation is, or this is what the new guidance is, or this is the direction that we're pivoting towards. So we're as clear as possible about our expectations, and we did our best to be disciplined in the messages that we were giving. I think that consistency and discipline really helped us legitimize our activities, even for those skeptics and even some of the resistance as well. So fun fact that AGU researchers don't just submit to AGU journals, and they really reflect a wide array of affiliations and challenges and backgrounds. So our issues were not just AGU issues. So we employed what I have here is the 3 C's. It could be a 4th C, but I started with the conversation with other publishers and other researchers, learning from what their experiences are and guidance and expectations. How are things going in their areas? And from those conversations, they led to collaboration. You know, we started talking to other societies and groups to really expand some of those conversations and make them a little bit more meaningful, to identify common challenges and develop use cases and shared responses. And this led to coordination of efforts, similar to what the RDA framework provides. So we want, if an author was trying to avoid AGU's strict open data policies, if they were going to go to another leading publisher, they would have the same expectations. So together we were collectively saying, well, this is what we are doing. And that I believe that solidarity, showing that we are all on the same page and in agreement, is critical to the research enterprise. The community began developing tools to help respond to some of the more difficult questions, and more collaborators joined the movement to share the impact of their areas and contribute to solutions and guidance. This naturally created more sophisticated questions that needed more comprehensive thoughts. Some of the questions listed here are still under consideration, and they're really tough questions, and it's important to give as right of an answer at the time that we can offer. The RDA framework really responds to some of these pervasive questions and gives really some valuable guidance. So the community continued to respond and to to the new and emerging questions and unique scenarios that were being revealed. I'd be remiss if I failed to acknowledge the leadership of Brooks Hansen, Shelley Stahl, and Chris Erdman on behalf of AGU's contributions and involvement, along with the input of the editors and our members at AGU. These are some of the things that have emerged that, some of the tools that have emerged that I think really give great guidance into what the community was asking for and what they really needed as well. So in terms of FAIR, I think most people here already understand it, but I'm going to let you in on a little secret, but it's only for those of you who are online right now, so you can tell your friends that decided to go to the Friday meeting instead that they really missed it. So we all know findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But how do I make my research findable, accessible, and interoperable? Use persistent identifiers and preserve your data in a trusted repository and document your data well. That's the findable and accessible part. Move forward to interoperable. Also, document your data very well. And for reusable, here's the real trick. It's a simple equation: findable plus accessible plus interoperable equals reusable, but similar to what the RDA framework represents or reflects, please license your data as openly as possible or the whole thing falls apart. So remember, your friends missed it, but you got it. This is the secret right here. So in our musings at AGU, we came across an impasse of sorts. The culture was shifting, but the culture shifting, but we're not quite there yet. So we're in the middle, right? So we know what we want people to do, but we also know where they're at, and we're trying to meet them somewhere in the middle. Everything can't be a requirement right away. So some of our expectations had to come in the form of recommendations. Remember when the best place for data availability statement was in the acknowledgements? At that time we were thinking about this, it seemed like a no-brainer. Let's just put the data availability statements in the acknowledgements. As Jake mentioned earlier, the more robust and more informed the data availability statement is, the more valuable it is. And definitely not the contact corresponding author for data. So, taking into consideration the early adopters and the skeptics and the resistance are all watching and they're waiting to offer their many opinions. We know better now that, the data citation is really critical. But what does a good citation look like? And what exactly, what repository is best for you? How specific are we talking? And we didn't even start talking in this conversation about software, but those considerations introduce another package of new considerations that we need to explore and offer guidance and really think through what's best for our audience. So what are the requirements for peer review versus for publication? And this kind of aligns really good with the RDA framework. As you can see, expectations are generally the same. So at the time of submission, a repository isn't necessary at the time of submission, and the data can be in supporting information for peer review. Again, that is at submission, but the data availability statement at that time should explain what the plan is for depositing the data into a repository. Where are you going to go? What are your thoughts? At the time of acceptance and just prior to publication, the expectation is that the data is in a repository. Supporting information is also okay at the time of publication because, as Jake mentioned, we don't want to get into this back and forth with the authors, but it's not necessary. And we're having ongoing discussions about other considerations, like including the role of a Jupyter notebook, for example, in peer review and where it really fits into the ecosystem. So I'm probably about at time. I hope I didn't go over. But here's some really quick takeaways to think about. Remember the 3 C's. The 4th C I mentioned, it could also be community. So the conversation, collaboration, and coordination. And if you want to add a 4th C, it'll be the community, really coming together to inspire this change. Consistent message discipline is really critical to establish that trust. Don't pretend to have all of the answers, because nobody does, but elevate the importance of the questions and welcome them, especially from the resistance. I told you they're my favorite group because they pull no punches. They let you know exactly where you're going to go wrong and how it's going to all fail. And those are the ones you really want to listen to, and they'll give you the best considerations. And finally, as we continue to evolve, what's best today may be the acknowledgments of tomorrow. So the goal is that consistent message. The goal is a consistent message that we need to be disciplined about. And finally, serenade the mountain while playing the acoustic guitar, because it makes for a really, really fun journey as we go through all of these activities. But thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to you, Leah.
Thank you so much, Randy and Jake and Iain, for these excellent overviews and all your candid insights on actually implementing policies around data in real time in our real world. I also just wanted to call out, there's been a lot of posting of good exemplars and approaches to data policies at other publishing efforts in the chat, and the chat will be captured along with the slides and the recording after the webinar. So it's great. There's also been a lot of exchange of ideas and questions between people. So please, this is a networking opportunity to follow up on after the webinar. We won't have time today. I just did want to just call out, we've heard a lot of key challenge areas across everyone's experience, particularly say licensing, repositories, citation, time frame for this work. I guess one sort of question is, now what do we need more conversations and more opportunities like the Cope Desk workshops to help publishers help each other with some of these ideas and approaches?
Yes.
All right, AGU.
Yeah, on the DMP in particular, I mean, I think, I think that's the next frontier from my perspective, is, integrating what they're doing in publications from what they said they do with the DMP. I think that's the next big step from my perspective.
Pulling them together a little bit more, so maybe that's a workshop area, in fact, actually with cross stakeholders, particularly funders, publishers, and other stakeholders for sure. You did get some questions in the chat and offline also, Jake, about your reference to that DMP, the statement you made. So hopefully we can follow up on that. Any other questions? Rolf, you have a question really briefly.
Yeah, hi, Rolf Kral from Helmholtz-Zentrum Berlin. I would like to highlight the importance of proper data citations. So we help our users make proper data publications, curate the bibliographic metadata of that data sets. In the end, in the paper journey, we find data availability statement, data is available under that URL, but the data set does not appear in the reference. And that's a pity, because then the link to the data is not in the Crossref metadata.
So more clarification in that. Iain, is there something in the framework that gets at, I know that came up this morning, right, in our little exchange on the top reference.
Yes, absolutely. There's a standard feature for data citation, but also there are different options for how one implements it, whether your goal is simply raising awareness with the community, and that's a kind of softer requirement, or whether if you're a bit more advanced and you're actually trying to really affect the practice of data citation. So yeah, it's certainly a key feature that's addressed.
Any last minute burning thoughts? I just know we're at the top of the hour and probably people have to go. So this has just been a great, I wanted to also call out the emphasis on importance of community and working with authors as partners on this. So I appreciate both publishers who have participated today emphasizing that important conversation of engaging scientists. So thank you for sharing your experiences. And thank you for the framework. Will there be a V2? So I just want to call out our next seminar will be on August 6th. It's on researcher perspective. So it kind of follows on that theme for improving data sharing and reuse. And it will be following a study that's been spearheaded by Sarah Nusser at the Iowa State University in conjunction with NSF. All right. See you all in August. Thank you.